Jaxon Lee stood beneath the blazing California sun, his championship medals glinting under the glare of flashing cameras, a swagger in his step as he made his way toward the entrance of the Avalon Arena for the celebrity martial arts charity event, his entourage trailing behind him like shadows, trying to keep pace with his ego. At just 28, he was the undefeated national Taekwondo champion, known not just for his lightning-fast kicks, but for his razor-sharp tongue. And today, he had one goal in mind: to dominate the spotlight and prove, once again, that the new generation of fighters had no equals. As he walked down the red carpet, he paused for a moment to flash his signature smirk at the reporters, then caught sight of Sylvester Stallone arriving at the venue with minimal fanfare. "Look at that," Jaxon muttered to a fellow fighter, loud enough for nearby ears. "Rocky's still pretending he can throw a punch. Must be hard when your glory days were scripted." Laughter erupted from his group, and a few awkward glances were exchanged among the organizers. But Stallone didn't flinch. He simply nodded politely and kept walking, his eyes calm, unreadable. Inside the arena, as guests filled their seats and the stage was set for exhibitions and speeches, Jaxon made it a point to keep the attention on himself, signing autographs with exaggerated flair and throwing shadow kicks for fans eager to film short clips. His name was everywhere, his face plastered on screens, but the veteran actors and martial artists in attendance, from Chuck Norris to Don the Dragon Wilson, quietly acknowledged another man among them, the one with nothing left to prove. Stallone, in his mid-70s but still bearing the rugged, carved presence of a lifelong athlete, greeted each guest with grace, posing for photos and speaking with humility about the cause they were all supporting: raising money for underprivileged kids to access martial arts training. Jaxon, however, remained on his mission, seeking every opportunity to make his presence felt. And when he took the microphone during his turn on stage, he couldn't help but push the boundary between charm and arrogance. He began with a few jokes about how fast he was, joking that if they made a new Expendables movie, he'd have to slow down so Stallone could keep up, eliciting chuckles from the crowd. But a few more lines in, the tone shifted. "I mean, respect to the classics and all," Jaxon said with a sly grin. "But let's be real, movie fighting isn't real fighting. What we do today, what I do, is speed, timing, power, precision. It's evolution. You can't fake that with a camera cut." The room quieted slightly, and even though his words were cloaked in smiles, everyone understood who he was talking about. Stallone, seated near the front, simply gave a patient smile and remained still, his hands resting on his lap, his demeanor calm. Jaxon continued his speech, but the seed had been planted, a subtle challenge, a provocation masked in jest, the kind of prideful flex that carried more than just competitive energy, it carried disrespect. Backstage, a few event organizers exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't what the event was about. But Stallone, ever composed, walked over during the intermission and congratulated Jaxon on his success, offering a hand that Jaxon shook half-heartedly. "Thanks, man," Jaxon said with a grin. "Always good to meet someone who inspired a generation. No hard feelings, right?" "None at all," Stallone replied, his voice gravelly but kind. "You've got the fire. That's good. Just be careful it doesn't burn down more than it builds." The words hovered in the air like smoke after a slow-burning fire, and Jaxon gave a half-laugh, brushing them off. Then came the moment that would change everything. One of the announcers, sensing the tension and looking to boost crowd engagement, proposed a friendly exhibition round between Stallone and any volunteer. Before anyone could respond, Jaxon stepped up. "I'll do it," he said loudly. "Let's have some fun, unless Rocky's got a dentist appointment or something." The crowd chuckled, but many felt a rising unease. Stallone hesitated only for a second before nodding. "All right," he said, stretching his shoulders. "Just a light round, nothing serious." Jaxon chuckled as he walked to the mat, already bouncing on the balls of his feet, while Stallone moved more slowly, his steps deliberate, his eyes locked onto his younger opponent with quiet focus. The referee stepped between them, explained the rules. No strikes to the head, controlled contact, 3 minutes, and then step back. The bell rang. At first, Jaxon danced circles around Stallone, throwing teasing sidekicks and pulling them back before contact, treating the match like a show, a performance for laughs and applause. The crowd played along, clapping as he flipped and spun, clearly enjoying himself. But Stallone never smiled. His posture stayed steady, his movement minimal, his eyes tracking every motion like a chess master studying a brash novice. 30 seconds in, the tone shifted. Stallone stepped forward with a quick, tight low kick that tapped Jackson's lead leg just enough to stop his rhythm. Then another. Then a feint followed by a body shot that, while controlled, clearly caught Jackson by surprise. The crowd gasped. Stallone wasn't just participating, he was reading, responding, and slowly closing the gap. Jackson's grin faded slightly as he realized the older man's timing was razor-sharp, his balance perfect, his conditioning far better than anyone had assumed. Another 30 seconds passed, and Stallone began controlling the center of the mat, cutting off Jackson's angles, intercepting his attacks with blocks that absorbed power and redirected energy. Jackson threw a spinning hook kick, one of his signature moves, and Stallone ducked it effortlessly, stepping in with a counter elbow that halted just an inch from Jackson's chest. The crowd exploded. For the first time, Jackson looked rattled. He backed up, eyes wide, and reassessed the man in front of him. This wasn't a movie star fumbling through staged punches. This was a fighter, a real one. What Jackson didn't know, and what would soon go viral around the world, was that Sylvester Stallone had trained in real martial arts since the 1970s, had sparred with legends, and held black belts in multiple disciplines, including full-contact karate. He was a 5-time world karate champion, titles he never advertised because he didn't need to. For him, martial arts were never about the spotlight. They were about the grind, the inner discipline, and the stories that never made headlines. Jackson, trying to regain control, launched a flurry of fast kicks, hoping to overwhelm his older opponent. But Stallone stayed calm, parrying, deflecting, slipping past them like water around stone. Then came the moment that broke the illusion. With a swift pivot and perfectly timed sweep, Stallone dropped Jackson to the mat with shocking precision. Not with force, but with flawless technique. The crowd erupted, unsure whether to cheer or gasp. But when Stallone immediately reached out to help Jackson up, the applause grew into a standing ovation. Jackson, face red with sweat and ego bruised, took the hand and stood, nodding slowly. The match was declared over, a friendly exhibition, no official winner, but everyone in the building knew what they had just witnessed. Jackson had walked in expecting to humiliate an old man, but instead found himself humbled by a warrior he never saw coming. Stallone didn't gloat. He bowed respectfully, turned to the audience, and raised Jackson's hand with his own. "He's got speed," Stallone said into the mic with a grin, "but sometimes the tortoise has a few tricks left." The crowd roared with laughter and cheers, but beneath the noise, something deeper had shifted. Jackson looked over at Stallone, not as an actor, not as an icon, but as a martial artist who had just taught him a lesson without saying a single harsh word. He didn't know it yet, but that moment would become the turning point of his career, not because he lost, but because he finally understood what it meant to truly fight, with respect, patience, and honor forged over a lifetime. The crowd still buzzed from the shock of what they'd witnessed as the exhibition match concluded, but the real electricity was just beginning to ripple through the arena, like a thunderstorm building behind cloud cover, unseen but undeniable. Word spread like wildfire backstage. Sylvester Stallone had gone toe-to-toe with Jaxon Lee, the undefeated Taekwondo phenom, and not only held his own, but controlled the rhythm with surgical technique and iron composure. Whispers became roars as clips flooded social media, capturing Stallone's impeccable footwork, his flawless sweep, and the moment he lifted Jackson back to his feet with the humility of a true master. Jackson, meanwhile, walked back to the locker room drenched in sweat and stunned silence. His adrenaline drained, his pride tangled in confusion, and the cold realization setting in that he had just underestimated a man who hadn't needed to fight for applause in decades. He had expected a choreographed spar, a celebrity appearance for charity, but what he got was a front-row lesson in what real fighting looked like when stripped of ego. Still, part of him wanted to believe he could reset the tempo if given another chance. So when one of the organizers approached and gently asked if he'd be willing to go another round in a more formal demo later that afternoon, Jaxon didn't hesitate. Yeah, he said, wiping his face, but this time, I take it seriously. The second match was announced as a traditional showcase for charity, and most attendees thought it would be a calm, respectful exhibition, perhaps with slowed-down techniques and smiles exchanged mid-round. But neither Stallone nor Jaxon treated it as play. When they stepped onto the mat again, something was different. Stallone no longer looked like the aging icon making a cameo. He looked like a disciplined fighter rising from retirement, standing like a coiled spring dressed in a crisp GI with a black belt worn down from decades of training. Jaxon, equally focused, wore a modern dobok and bounced lightly, no longer taunting, no longer grinning, but moving like a man who knew the reputation of his opponent was no longer built on movies. The referee signaled the start, and this time Jaxon opened strong. No showboating, no teasing strikes, just clean, high-level Taekwondo combinations. Side kick to roundhouse, pivot to spinning back kick. But to his growing disbelief, Stallone didn't just block, he anticipated. He moved like someone who had internalized thousands of hours of sparring, who had bled in real dojos, who had endured full-contact wars that left more than bruises. They left wisdom. Stallone's counters weren't flashy, they were precise. A parry followed by a low-chambered punch to the ribs, a slip into a tight ridge hand that stopped inches from Jackson's temple, each one a whisper away from contact. The crowd fell into stunned silence, unsure whether they were watching choreography or destiny, as the older man began to dismantle the younger fighter's rhythm without raising his voice, without breaking his breath. Every time Jaxon tried to press forward with speed, he was met with stillness that turned to control, control that turned to pressure, pressure that bent him backward in unfamiliar ground. Jaxon landed a few glancing blows. He was still a champion, after all, but each point earned was met with a look from Stallone that carried more weight than retaliation. The kind of look a mentor gives a student when they finally strike clean, but know it's still not enough. The real shift came 2 minutes in when Jaxon attempted a jumping spin kick and Stallone, with an almost lazy sidestep, pivoted and redirected him with a classic foot trap into a backward stumble. It wasn't violent, it was masterful, and it told the crowd everything. This wasn't some lucky stunt by a fit celebrity. This was calculated, grounded technique, the kind of thing that took decades to master. The arena erupted, some people cheering, others simply staring, mouths agape. Sitting in the front row, martial arts legends who'd trained beside Stallone in the 80s and 90s nodded to one another knowingly, murmuring that the world was finally seeing what they had long known but never broadcast. Stallone was the real deal. Not just strong, not just famous, but a fighter of discipline, humility, and formidable technical skill. The round ended not with a knockout or a clear victor, but with mutual respect crystallized in body language. Jaxon, panting, chest heaving, bowed first, lower than etiquette required, and Stallone bowed back, eyes steady, his breathing calm as if he'd just finished a morning jog. The announcer declared it a draw, but no one in the audience believed it. Not out of disrespect to Jaxon, but because they'd seen what he hadn't. That fighting isn't just about age or speed. It's about control, about mind over muscle. Backstage, the mood had changed dramatically. Fighters who'd once gathered around Jaxon for autographs now found themselves quietly moving towards Stallone, seeking stories, advice, a handshake. Jaxon sat alone for a while, a towel over his head, reliving every second of the match. He landed some clean shots, yes. He'd pushed the tempo, but it felt like throwing darts at a fortress. The man he mocked, the man he assumed would fade under pressure, had outlasted him, not by brute force, but by simply knowing more. And that realization stung deeper than any punch. Eventually, Jaxon was joined by a young female fighter, a teammate of his, who said nothing for a moment before quietly adding, "You didn't lose. You learned." He didn't respond right away. He just sat there, replaying every moment. Finally, he said, "I thought he was just a boxer who hit the bag for cameras. But that guy, he's something else." That evening, after the event concluded and the audience trickled out into the Los Angeles dusk, Video clips from the matches had already gone viral. Headlines screamed across every platform. Stallone stuns Taekwondo champ in charity match, and Rocky was real all along. But what mattered more than the media frenzy was the whisper spreading across the martial arts community, that there were legends walking among them whose greatness wasn't written in highlight reels, but etched in decades of training, in bruises and respect. That night, a special dinner was held for the event's top guests, and Stallone was seated quietly at a table with a few old friends from his fighting days. Jaxon, still sore, still quiet, approached the table with hesitation. A hush fell across the room. Then Stallone stood and smiled. "That was good work out there," he said, his tone warm but grounded. Jaxon nodded slowly, then extended his hand. "I was wrong," he said. "No camera around, no microphone in sight about you, about what real fighting is. I thought I was at the top, but you show me how far I have to go." Stallone shook his hand firmly. "We all start there," he said. "The trick is not staying there." Later that night, Stallone told a few stories of his time training in dojos overseas, sparring in underground tournaments during film shoots, and learning from masters who didn't care about fame. Jaxon listened to every word. There was no mockery now, only respect. And inside him, something began to shift. Not just admiration, but hunger. Not to prove himself to the world, but to rise to the level of a man who fought not for trophies, but for mastery. The internet would keep buzzing for weeks. Commentators would analyze every clip. Some would say Stallone still had it. Others would argue that he never lost it. But only Jaxon truly understood what had happened on that mat. Not a defeat, but a passing of something ancient and sacred, a silent transmission between generations. The kind that couldn't be taught, only earned. 3 weeks after the legendary charity match, the echoes of Sylvester Stallone's performance had reached beyond martial arts forums and viral videos. It had become a cultural conversation, reigniting debates on age, mastery, and humility in the fight world. Jaxon Lee, once the brash poster boy of modern Taekwondo, found himself in an unfamiliar position, not just as the subject of memes and slowed-down replays, but as the fighter who'd been humbled, not by brute force, but by timing, wisdom, and a man twice his age who never had anything to prove. For a few days, the sting clung to him like sweat after a hard spar. He ducked media calls, ignored sponsorship chatter, and kept his training quiet, retreating from the spotlight that had once chased him. But something deeper was stirring within Jaxon, something stronger than shame. Purpose. What Stallone had done to him wasn't a humiliation. It was a gift, a mirror held up to show him the gaps in his own foundation. And while most young champions might have doubled down on ego or rewritten the narrative to protect their pride, Jaxon did the opposite. He reached out. Through a mutual contact at the event, he called Stallone. Not for a rematch, not for a public stunt, but for mentorship. "I want to learn," he said simply over the phone. "I want to understand what you know. I'm done trying to be the best for cameras. I want to be the real thing." On the other end of the line, Stallone chuckled. "Then meet me at 6 a.m. tomorrow," he said. "No press. Just bring gloves." What followed over the next month was a transformation that not even Jackson's closest friends saw coming. Every morning before the sun rose, he met Stallone at a private gym tucked into a quiet neighborhood in Burbank, a place filled not with glossy equipment or Instagram-ready mirrors, but with the scent of old leather mitts, worn-down mats, and the silence of focused effort. Stallone trained him not in high kicks or flying spins, but in rhythm, stillness, footwork drills that looked simple but demanded hours to grasp, body weight conditioning that reminded Jaxon his muscles had been decorative, not forged. Stallone spoke little during the sessions, letting movement do the teaching, but when he did speak, it carried weight. "You don't fight the opponent," he said one morning between sets. "You fight your habits. Beat those, you win everything." It wasn't flashy. It wasn't social media friendly, but it was changing Jaxon from the inside out. Slowly, he stopped seeking speed for speed's sake. He listened. He waited. He learned the beat of a fight. Not the chaos, but the music beneath it. Stallone showed him old sparring tapes, fights from tournaments the media never covered, footage of real warriors who didn't care for the camera. Each night, Jaxon would go home exhausted, not just from exertion, but from confronting the pride that had clouded his journey. A month into training, Stallone offered him something unexpected. "There's a small invitational coming up," he said. "Underground, invite only. No belts, no titles. Just fighters. You ready?" Jaxon hesitated, but only for a second. "Yeah," he said, "but only if I earn it." Stallone smiled. "You already are." The event was hosted in a forgotten gymnasium in Koreatown. Nothing more than folding chairs, weathered mats, and fighters who didn't know or care who followed who on Instagram. Jaxon walked in unannounced, unrecognized, wearing a plain black GI. There were no fans, no flashing lights, just a room full of warriors. When he stepped onto the mat for his first match, he faced a Muay Thai fighter from Thailand, compact and lethal. The fight was brutal, knees, elbows, clinch work, but Jaxon stayed calm. He didn't retreat. He absorbed, redirected, and slowly took control, just like Stallone had shown him. His next opponent was a judo specialist who kept throwing him to the mat, but Jaxon adjusted his center, broke grips early, and countered with precision. One by one, he faced challenges he wouldn't have survived weeks earlier. And by the time the final bout arrived, a freestyle match with a Russian kickboxer, he wasn't the same man who had danced for cameras. He moved like water. No flash, just form. He didn't win every round, but he endured. And at the end of the night, the fighters gathered to shake hands, bowing to each other in mutual respect. Stallone had sat quietly in the back row, baseball cap low, arms crossed, watching every second. When Jaxon approached him after the event, he didn't expect a trophy or even praise. "How'd I do?" he asked, wiping blood from his lip. Stallone looked at him. "You fought with soul," he said. "That's the win." In the weeks that followed, the story reached the mainstream. News outlets caught wind that Jaxon Lee had been training with Stallone, not for a movie, but for real. Articles started shifting tone, from Stallone embarrasses Taekwondo champ to Jaxon Lee seeks redemption through real training. Invitations started pouring in for talk shows, magazine interviews, and fight commentaries. But this time, Jaxon was selective. He turned down fluff appearances. He accepted one, a long-form sit-down on a martial arts podcast, where he opened up about what really happened. "I went into that event thinking I knew everything," he admitted. "And Stallone showed me how little I understood. That man didn't just teach me fighting. He taught me how to learn again." The podcast went viral, not for drama, but for its honesty. Fighters around the world resonated with the humility. Young martial artists wrote to Jaxon, thanking him for showing that pride could give way to growth. And behind the scenes, Stallone kept training him always early, always quietly. Months later, Jaxon entered an open-weight international invitational. This time, no one underestimated him, but they still didn't see what was coming. He moved like a man unshackled from ego. Every opponent he faced, he bowed to first. Every victory, he treated as a lesson. He reached the semifinals and narrowly lost to a Brazilian jiu-jitsu phenom, but walked off the mat smiling. When asked by a reporter how he felt, Jaxon said, "I lost a match, but I haven't lost a day since I started learning again." That quote ended up on posters, on gym walls, on social media graphics next to training montages. But Stallone never sought the credit. He just kept showing up, training quietly, sometimes watching from the back of the room, always nodding when Jaxon bowed before him. A year after the charity match, the event was held again. This time even larger, with media attention drawn by the legacy of the previous year. Jaxon was invited to give a keynote speech. He stood on the same stage where he once mocked the man who became his mentor, this time wearing a simple GI, a fresh black belt and Shotokan earned under Stallone's guidance, and spoke from the heart. Last year, he said, "I stood on this stage thinking I was the future. But the truth is, there is no future in this sport without the past. And that past stood right in front of me, taught me, forgave me, and made me better." He gestured to Stallone, seated in the front row. The entire audience stood and applauded, louder than before, not for spectacle, but for growth. Afterward, they shared a moment backstage, just the two of them. Jaxon looked him in the eye and said, I still have a long way to go." Stallone smiled. "Good," he said. "Means you're on the right path."